Japan participated in World War II between 1942 and 1945, when the Bushido Code had a large impact on Japanese society. At this time, Japan was also hungry for power after having recently defeated and occupied other countries. The Bushido Code was a very important cultural belief to Japan, developed over hundreds of years, that was able to prevent them from surrendering in World War II after massive loss of life. The code demanded that they fight to the death and never surrender, including killing themselves if they got captured. It is amazing that Japan only surrendered after being bombed by atomic bombs twice, after losing 355,000 lives in seconds, and after a total of around 3 million Japanese military and civilian deaths. The Bushido Code delayed real diplomacy to end the war until its last days. There was a debate within Japan on whether Japan really should have surrendered or not at the point in the war when they had started to lose with no way to win. The Bushido Code was one of the greatest factors that prevented Japan from surrendering and forced the war to go on longer, which resulted in a larger loss of life than it would have otherwise been necessary. The Bushido Code was an extremely strict code of honor where believers were not afraid of death. The Bushido Code also commanded that they die before ever surrendering. In 1603, Japan cut off all trade with the rest of the world and continued to be in this state until 1868. This event brought peace to Japan, which left the samurai, who were fighters of Japan, who constantly killed each other with nothing to do. Japanese leaders now had to deal with thousands of people who were very dangerous warriors who could no longer fight. So Japan put these people into roles of power that were new to Japan because it was at peace. They became government officials and took other roles of power. These new samurai wanted to be like the samurai of old, the samurai before the Great Shutdown of Japan, as it is sometimes called. The samurai wanted to be like the samurai of old, so they tried to live up by their standards when trying to live up to them. The new samurai made their new standards more strict and intense than the original standards of the samurai really were. This continued generation after generation until the Bushido Code got as strict as it was in the early 1900s. The Bushido Code was so culturally important that in Japan, people were saying how if Japan didn't win the war, there would be 100 million dead. They were referring to the expectation that every Japanese would have to die before the end of the war unless they won. This was not even a saying that was spread by the government. Japanese people came up with this themselves because of how important the Bushido Code was to their society. The Japanese had a very disciplined culture and almost every Japanese followed it. It was common for a family to embrace the Bushido Code and do everything in commands. For example, there were families that literally gave their child a knife and said, "If you ever get caught, kill yourself with this knife." The power of the Bushido Code of Japan prevented Japan from engaging in diplomacy to end the war when they realized there was no way for them to win. There was not very much communication between the two sides during the very intense and deadly war. Instead of diplomacy, the two sides in the conflict came up with new tactics to convince each other that they couldn't win. Japan's strategy early was to use naval air power over land-based planes. This is now common, but was very different from the norm back then. Later, when they were in a place where most nations and societies would have just surrendered, instead they developed new tactics that showed how totally committed they were to the Bushido Code, sending the message that Japan was still fighting to win in order to scare the other side into giving up. Some of these tactics included the kamikaze, which is when you have a pilot fly a plane full speed at a boat or some other enemy vessel. The idea of just sending someone to die and getting a new person doing it over and over again with no way for them to survive is almost unheard of in other cultures, at least to this extent. The Allied forces used the effective strategy of island hopping, where they went from island to island, taking them one by one and getting slowly closer to the Japanese mainland. This was one of the strategies that helped the Allies get Japan to the point where they knew they were losing and had almost no way to win, and their best option was to surrender, because Japan didn't want the Allies to reach their mainland where most of their people lived. They also spread propaganda through Japan after the US or one of their allies did something devastating, like killing tens of thousands of Japanese, to get the Japanese people to want to surrender. However, the influence of the Bushido Code was so strong that it required the Americans to destroy not just Hiroshima, but also Nagasaki with atomic bombs. There were multiple different perspectives around whether or not Japan should surrender near the end of the war. Some Japanese thought they should surrender, and the emperor also saw that there was almost no way that Japan could be victorious. However, the Bushido Code was so powerful that it outweighed both the Japanese people and the emperor's misgivings. Once Japan did surrender after being bombed by atomic bombs twice, there were still many Japanese that didn't agree with the emperor's decision. The Bushido Code motivated the Japanese to conquer neighboring countries. But from the Western perspective, it was starting to become not cool for nations to go and take over other smaller, less powerful ones. Before this time period, it was relatively common for a European country to conquer countries in Africa or Asia. But around this time, Europe started to acknowledge the right of native people to have the freedom to rule themselves and pressured others to do the same. So the Allies thought that Japan shouldn't be waging war even before it attacked US via Pearl Harbor, causing them to formally be at war with each other. There is also the perspective of the United States, that Japan was hurting lots of people, including not only Allied soldiers, but also civilians from nearby territory that was held by the US. If the Japanese continued to fight, many more of their people would die as well, so surrender will end up benefiting both sides. The Western perspective valued lies over the Bushido Code's form of honor. As a result of the Bushido Code preventing the surrender of Japan, the US killed even more Japanese, with there being around 750,000 civilian deaths and 2,100,000 military deaths, including from the atomic bombs. There were a lot more deaths in battle on both sides. For example, the Battle of Okinawa alone caused the loss of 12,500 American lives and an astonishing 200,000 Japanese civilian and military deaths. Both sides, but particularly the Japanese, came up with strategies that nowadays would be completely unacceptable, including having people hold points and die for no reason. Also, during the Battle of Okinawa, there were thousands of Japanese who, instead of surrendering, took their own lives. According to historian Dan Carlin in Supernova of the East, the Japanese of this time period were one of the most disciplined people of all time. Even now, the Japanese are very disciplined and work hard on everything they do, but there is less of an expectation that if you don't succeed, you must die. Because of the Bushido Code, today some people in other countries do see Japan as more disciplined, including because it took a lot of discipline to avoid surrendering for so long. As a result, Americans sometimes see Japan and the Japanese as strong, smart, and powerful people who make good allies. Currently, Japan is also one of the two Asian countries, including South Korea, that Americans most respect and are most closely allied with. The Bushido Code helped Japan in that way because it is good to be seen as an ally and a friend. This, however, may have happened anyways, even if the Bushido Code didn't exist, because Japan was becoming more similar to a Western country and could have continued to become a more powerful potential ally. The Bushido Code evolved out of samurai culture in Japan over hundreds of years to become an extremely strict code where everyone fights to the death and never surrenders. This led to Japan refusing to surrender during World War II, even after the US dropped a first atomic bomb on their homeland. One of a series of increasingly drastic tactics both sides used to show they would do anything to win. The Allies weighed reducing total loss of life over Japan's loyalty to the Bushido Code's sense of honor. This absolute discipline may have contributed to Japan's eventually becoming a powerful ally, but it cost millions of lives unnecessarily.